Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to have a look at the Coastal Douglas Fir. In a previous video we looked at the smaller and colder tolerant cousin, the Rocky Mountain Douglas Fir. So today we'll look at what really is one of the forest giants on the west coast of North America, which is the Coastal Douglas Fir. And here we have a fairly large mature tree here, by no means as large as they get. This one is about a meter or just over 3 feet diameter. And maybe the one over here, close to it here, is a little easier to get to. But you can see here we have a very, very tall tree. And it's generally without branches on the lower reaches due to the lack of light in these. This is a small pocket of kind of older growth, mature forest among areas of logged, or that have been recently logged actually. So let's have a look at the bark here. First off, it is a little different looking than the Rocky Mountain Douglas Fir. It still has those very rough characteristics in an older tree. They generally don't hold a lot of moss, but you can see this particular tree does have some. In these coastal forests here, this is in British Columbia, where we are right now. These coastal forests, the big leaf maples really hold a lot of moss as opposed to some of the conifers. So yeah, well, these are a couple of mature specimens. It's kind of hard to see a lot except for the bark characteristics on a tree like this because they are so tall and there's not a lot of branches or needles or anything you can look at down low. So what we'll do is we'll have a look for maybe a younger specimen, so we can have a close look at the needles and see if we can find some cones. Okay, so here is a cone. This is one of last year's cones. So most of the seeds, looks like, are gone. And I will show here this bract right there, where my thumb is there. That's a pretty clear identifier of the Douglas Fir over other conifers. So this is a pretty typical size cone, probably 3 inches or so long, maybe an inch wide. This came from a mature tree. I don't know if it really matters if it did or didn't. However, this is the size that I most of the time that I see. So I will have a look for a this year's cone, but most of them haven't fallen from the trees yet. It's early September here. So there we have what probably the cone and the bark are the easiest ways in my mind to identify the Douglas Fir over some of the other trees that grow in the area, like hemlock. And as you can see here, this is a younger forest here. This area has been logged once, maybe even more. And it's mostly hemlock here. And the hemlock, here's a young one right here. The hemlock has similar kind of flat needles, except for it's in kind of a single plane rather than around the branch. Very distinct from the Douglas Fir. So I will we'll move on and we'll kind of look at see if we can find a younger fir with some branches close to the ground. Okay, so here we have some of this year's cones that are containing seeds. And something interesting is many of them here have been completely stripped of the scales and seeds, and probably by like some sort of small mammal like a squirrel or something like that. looking for the seeds. But a little bit interesting that, you know, how valuable these are to the ecosystem here. So as you can see, these cones are still closed and they still contain their seeds, but those bracts are still quite prominent, and that's kind of the difference between a new and an old cone. The old cones, the scales are open, the seeds have been distributed, and these ones have just fallen from the tree. There's quite a bit of resin keeping them closed. That'll dry out and open up, or an animal, something will do something like this, strip the cone, take the seeds as they need, and go from there. All right, looks like we've come across a pretty amazing example of an old growth Douglas fir. This one is at least 2.5 meters, 8 feet or somewhere around there across at the base, so that's a diameter. And it's hard to estimate the height, but this one is probably 200 feet, somewhere in that region. Pretty amazing. And you can see the bark is so rough. I'll just put my hand there for scale. These are just enormous kind of scales in the bark. Pretty amazing. And these trees are still around. There's not nearly as many as there used to be, obviously, but they are a relatively fast growing tree compared to some. They generally grow, the young ones you'll see more in sunny areas. So it's kind of a species that is interesting because originally, you know, after a disturbance, Douglas fir will be one of those species that grow fairly quickly. But the coastal Douglas fir is quite long-lived as well. So it may be in certain areas, in the kind of areas of very low disturbance, they can be, you know, 500 to 1,000 years old. So they end up being kind of a pioneer species, but then extending into the old growth of the forest and into the ancient forest. So kind of an interesting species. And they grow, as you can see, with here we have beside it another large Douglas fir, but in between western hemlock, and a lot of red cedar here. So the red cedar and hemlock are more shade tolerant, so they will eventually take over a stand that may be Douglas fir dominated in the beginning. So as the firs thin out, the hemlock and the cedar kind of grow in around it. As you can see here, there's a lot of cedar, a lot of hemlock, such as this one here growing out of downed log here. Hemlock's a really interesting species. We'll have a look at that one as well. But yeah, so these giants do still exist. Fortunately, the coastal Douglas fir is such an enormous tree. It's hard to really show the scale of something this big. You know, exceptional trees can be 95 meters, 300 feet plus. So really hard to kind of get on video how just the size of these things. I believe the tallest tree in Canada was in Strathcona Provincial Park on Vancouver Island in Cathedral Grove, and it was over 300 feet or somewhere in the 100-meter range. So unfortunately, I believe that one fell in a storm, but just goes to show just the enormous size of these things. So we're still looking for a younger one, but here we are in a bit of an old growth area, not really conducive to young Douglas fir. So that's why it's a little bit hard to find. All right, here we have a very early stage of life Douglas fir here, if we can focus. This would likely be its first year. Here, we'll just gently move it. So if we can focus on that, let's see if we put something behind it. There's a very early stage. It's a couple of inches tall and right next to a hemlock seedling. Again, likely the first year, but you can see this one is amongst a whole bunch of fir cones. Even though this is a fairly shady area, it looks like this one managed to germinate. Hard to say on its prospects for growth under such shade, but there is the early stage of life of a Douglas fir, from this to a 300-foot giant, which is pretty incredible. Okay, so we have a pretty good little branch here that we can have a little closer look at the needles here. We can see that just like other Douglas fir, these are flat needles, meaning they don't necessarily roll in your hand. And even though it's not a true fir, just like all other ones as well, the saying fir is flat does work for Douglas fir as well. And there's a bit of a silvery color, as you can kind of see as we turn this, underneath the needles. So very similar to what we looked at with the Rocky Mountain Douglas fir, except for essentially the size is, and I guess the bark a little bit as well, but the size is just very, very different. So also it looks like we have some seeds from the cones here scattered. You can, here's a good one right there. So these are the seeds that are hidden in between the cone scales. So when this was a cone that either hit here and kind of shattered, that's ready, and these seeds kind of fly away. They're very light, very small. My hands are sticky, unfortunately, from the cones that we've just been touching. So yeah, so that's the Douglas fir seed. We'll just put this one in the ground here, and who knows, maybe that'll be the next giant. So thanks. We'll end the video there. Thanks for watching. And yeah, just one of these spectacular forest giants. You know, it's just an amazing tree. So I encourage everybody to go out and have a look at some Coastal Douglas fir. Thanks.